Dear students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. You are participating now in the course on social policy, and the module that we will be discussing today is called Globalization. My name is Sohini Sengupta. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. Let us look at the objective of this module. The objective of this module is to familiarize you, the learner, with the phenomena of globalization. Globalization, what it means socially, politically, as well as culturally. We are also going to look at the effect of globalization on the welfare state. You will be familiar by now with the concept of welfare state as it has been discussed in a previous module. We will also look at the opportunities and challenges that globalization presents for social policy. Most of us think of ourselves nowadays as global citizens. Although we are located in specific national territories, we are free to imagine ourselves elsewhere. We know about lives and societies and cultures, languages, customs, all kinds of things, political institutions, ideas. Nothing that happens somewhere else in the world failed to touch us in today's world, more so than any other time in previous epochs or historical times, essentially because we are bound together by the information economy. We are also bound together by modern means of transportation. We can travel to different parts of the world at a very, very fast pace. It would have taken months to travel from one country to the other once upon a time, in ships, by foot, on caravans. And today we can manage the journey in a couple of hours. All of this brings us really closer to other cultures and other societies. Does it make us, therefore, global citizens? Does it make us, therefore, tolerant of other people and places elsewhere? What does it do to our relationships with each other in our own societies and own states? How are the thoughts that evolve elsewhere in the world, when it reaches our shores, how do they change? How do they affect, how do they influence our most cherished beliefs and most historical policies? So are we becoming more open to change? Are we becoming more able to deal with the transformed world? Or do we become far more resistant to change when we want to preserve our heritage, our culture, our resources, our rights? Do we actually become far more inward looking when we feel threatened by the processes happening elsewhere in the world? We will try to understand some of these phenomena that is sweeping our worlds at present times and how it influences the way we look at social policy. In globalization, in common usage has come to mean various things such as the free market policies or economic liberalization. So much so that when most people, some people, especially social policy makers, social policy teachers, social policy students, the moment they talk about globalization, they will basically mean economic liberalization. Globalization also means in common usage westernization, Western forms of political, social, and cultural lives. Are we therefore all becoming like Western societies? Something that is neither desirable nor foreseeable in the near future. But by globalization, we do mean increasing exchange of influences across borders. New information technology or internet revolution is something everyone is familiar of. And when we talk today of certain modern forms of deprivation, we talk also about parts of our population who are not necessarily participating in this information revolution because they do not have access to digital technologies. So globalization means all of these things, but not reducible to any of these things in itself. If you want to look at globalization from a more macro or theoretical perspective, what it essentially means is changes in the spatial and temporal contours of social existence. Our social existence, essentially what it means, the shape, the dimension, and the content of our social existence are being transformed beyond imagination. Its boundaries, its borders, its outlines are changing, both spatially, because of the different types of space that we can occupy today, that has become possible for us, and also temporally, in the sense of how do we understand time, how do we use time, yeah, how we are able to reside in different time spaces at the same time with the use of information technology. This entire phenomena has been summarized by some theorists to describe it as a space-time compression. A compression of space and time is both getting compressed, not in a very physical sense, but also, no, actually, in a physical as well as in a metaphorical sense. What it does, therefore, it undermines local and national boundaries. How does it undermine local and national boundaries? If you are able to dwell in so many different spaces and time situations at any particular instance, how does your local identities, local affiliation, national feelings, national solidarity, ideas of citizenship, how does it stay strong? How does that work? Because we seem to be able to locate ourselves in so many spaces at the same time. Two kinds of things can come from this. One is, of course, and here I'm not making a value judgment, and I'm not saying that it's a bad thing or a good thing, but these are the two things that we should remember. One is deterritorialization, which means whatever you think, whoever you are, your identity, your belonging, your everyday life is not necessarily connected to territorial spaces anymore. The other thing is, of course, social interconnectedness. Today, we can feel highly connected to people located elsewhere in the world, and at the same time, we may lose the connections and ties that connected us to our communities and our societies the way it did in the past. So it's a process that is creating new connections. It might be weakening older forms of connections. What is the implication of these kinds of processes for social policy? Because if you remember the previous lectures, social policy is hinged upon the role of the state. Social policy is hinged upon the idea of a sovereign nation. Social policy requires citizenship. Social policy is very strong on legal status of citizenship. It's very clear about boundaries, about rights, about who's eligible, who's not eligible. How does globalization upset all that? How does globalization change capacities of people and nation states? One of the ways in which it does this is how it allows for the interpenetration of national, domestic, as against foreign or international boundaries. What does this mean? It means there has been considerable amount of exchange and interpretation in the interpenetrations in the world in all times. Normative ideals like democracy, justice, redistribution, all of these things did not emerge in a particular location all by itself. It happened through considerable exchange of ideas over long periods of time. People did always listen to and learn from each other. It's just that today the rate at which that is happening is far faster. It also means that the other implication is that one, of course, is that we located at different national context get influenced and follow ideas that come to us from elsewhere. On the other hand, the normative ideals, since as individually we are also located in different spaces, place and time, it means that the normative ideals like justice and redistribution and fairness, etc., need not just be pursued at a local, community or national levels, but need to be pursued globally if they are to have any effect. Let us take a very small example of someone who is a very highly qualified person who's completed 12 years of education, 2 years of higher education, 5 years of specialized education, and is now able to compete for employment anywhere in the world in any economy. And such a person obtains employment in a country to which the person does not belong to originally. Immediately the question would arise, does that person have legal status to be there in those countries? Will it be fair to deny such a person employment by arguing that since they are not citizens of those nations, therefore they are less eligible than citizens of those nations in competing for and succeeding in achieving that employment opportunity and therefore the opportunity to better themselves. Now, if you look at the visa regulations and rules that many countries have and the recent controversy of H-1B visa vis-a-vis Indian professionals trying to obtain employment in the United States, you would realize that normative ideals need to go beyond national levels if we are to address issues of transnational or transboundary forms of location of cells that globalization is making possible. We both require resources that are available elsewhere. We also need to be present elsewhere ourselves. A similar kind of example, from a very different end, from a disadvantageous end, can be about people who don't belong to any nation. People who are disadvantaged, who are ostracized, who are being told by several nations that they don't actually belong anywhere. And where would such a community then go? Does it matter that they don't belong to any particular national boundary? But to be able to provide fairness and justice to them, you then therefore need to have normative ideals that go beyond national boundaries, because there are some people who can no longer be defined by national boundaries. You take the example of boat people, you take the example of Rohingyas in Myanmar and various other such communities. There are other ways in which globalization affects social policies. These are interconnectedness leading to global cooperation, cooperative ways to deal with commonly recognized problems that affect many societies and communities all over the world. Take, for example, the global poverty reduction goals or global development goals, such as the Millennium Development Goals, known by the short form of MDG, or the Sustainable Development Goals, known by the short form of SDG. The Millennium Development Goals were created at the beginning of the 21st century, and they came to an end, their period came to an end in 2015. Essentially, MDG goals aimed to integrate national priorities about development and social deficit with broader global development strategies. Sustainable Development Goals, which were initiated in 2016 and are supposed to continue till 2030, begins where MDGs ended to try and weave in domestic national concerns with international concerns to create more interconnected global priorities and global strategies and global normative ideals to deal with people as they now exist, not fixed in national boundaries, but free-floating both in terms of ideas as well as in terms of their physical presence. If you want to look quickly at the different MDG goals, the Millennium Development Goals were 8 in number. The first one was eradicating poverty. The second one was universal education. The third one was about health. The fourth one was about reducing child mortality. The fifth one was about maternal health in general, environmental sustainability, and equal partnership in development. These 8 goals do not necessarily the 8 MDG goals do not necessarily address the contextual specificity of the social problems and issues that citizens in different countries are facing. But what they tried to encapsulate was, could there be a common minimal agenda that different countries evolve together and they can sit in one place and define, and then address these issues which affect the common future of humanity and try to deal with them in such a fashion. The SDG goals are about 17, and there are an elaboration of the MDG goals, and they are also fairly pitched in the same direction. And among the SDG goals, some of the key SDG goals that are relevant to countries like India and are as elsewhere, are again issues of hunger, poverty, health, education, environmental protection, and sustainable development. These are issues that are common to people here as well as elsewhere in the world. Now, MDGs and SDGs, these are just illustrations of different ways in which policies are now being made. Does it therefore mean that national governments have limited roles today in designing social policy? Let's look at this question by trying to understand what globalization actually really means. If we look at the SDG, if we look at the 17 SDG goals which are succeeding the MDG goals in the country, we realize that it reiterates the global commitment towards eradicating some of the common problems in the world, which include reducing poverty, eradicating hunger, improving health and education attainments, and protecting the environment. Now, the SDG and MDG goals actually signify what is happening to social policy, the internationalization per se of social policy, and moving it to beyond national boundaries. What it suggests, therefore, is that even if policy agendas were created beyond national boundaries, domestic policies can create specific interventions within these broad parameters to ensure that specificity of need is maintained while common problems that address humanity is addressed. Let us take a look at some of the ways in which the MDG has been trying to address this whole issue of common problems that face humanity. If you look at MDG goal 4, which was reducing child mortality, and the target was to reduce the under 5 mortality rate in different parts of the world. And here the data shows that at the end of the MDG period, what one can see is a considerable reduction in child mortality levels in all parts of the world. If you look at the developing parts of the world, where child mortality levels were very high to begin with in the 1990s, there has been a reduction almost by 50% or more. If you look at worldwide, the entire reduction has also been by 50%. If you look at the developing countries, the reduction has been even more, by almost 60%. Now, what does it essentially mean? When we have created a goal on reducing child mortality, it is based on the assumption that all over the world, all community societies agree that under 5 mortality rate is a good indicator of whether a society is healthy and whether a society is doing well or not. So it is a key social policy consideration for all national governments in any case to introduce policy and programs that would enable children to survive and thrive happily the first 5 years of their lives. The creation of MDG goal essentially has meant that the MDG 4 goal has essentially meant that child mortality rates are being monitored all over the world in order to understand how specific countries are performing as, in terms of fulfilling this very important global social policy objective. And as we can see, they are being able to demonstrate that child mortality levels are actually reducing all over the world. Let's take another example of environmental sustainability. Environmental sustainability was MDG goal 7, and it had various indicators. One of the indicators of environmental sustainability was emission of global greenhouse gas carbon dioxide in billions of metric tons. Now, if we look at the performance of MDG goal 7, we realize that the performance has not been that fantastic, because while under 5 mortality rate has been achieved well by most countries, environmental sustainability goal in the form of reducing emission of carbon dioxide has in fact not succeeded at all. In fact, if you look at the developed parts of the world, it has come down marginally between 1990 to 2012. But if you look at the developing parts of the world, the consumption of GHGs, or the emission of consumption of fossil fuels and hence emission of carbon dioxide in billion metric tons has actually increased by over 20%. What do you think this demonstrates? The success of MDG goal 4, the relative success at least that's what the indicator shows. Whatever the reality may differ to some extent, the MDG Goal 7 has clearly not been a success. What does it tell us? Does it somewhere show that perhaps this is a place where national and global priorities are not necessarily meeting? Maybe all national governments are not in agreement about whether reducing emission of carbon dioxide would lead to environmental sustainability, or whether environmental sustainability is a high priority for domestic social policy. So, therefore, globalization creates opportunities whereby the meeting of roads of national and global policies and the common understanding of social problems can create quite powerful ways of reducing disadvantage and vulnerabilities. It can also mean that disagreements between national government and global agendas can mean that certain types of goals will simply not be met. And environment protection seems to be one of those. So the target of MDG Goal 7, like I said, was integration of sustainable development principles into national program and policies. However, between 1990 and 2012, global greenhouse gas carbon dioxide emission increased by over 50%. Further increase in GHG emission is likely to warm the planet, affecting ecosystems and habitats. It would affect agriculture, create food shortages, may create weather aberrations, reduce monsoons, increase incidence of natural disasters. Now, interestingly, in many developing country context, poor people might get hugely affected by the global climate change that can emerge from GHG emissions, and GHG emissions are happening pretty much in the countries where a large number of poor people also live. Mitigating climate change. Climate change is a phenomenon which requires global cooperation. It requires different nations to come together and cooperate and act, simply because actions in one part of the world has the ability to affect people's lives at another part of the world. It is a classic example of a phenomena that requires a global action. Globalization, therefore, presents the opportunity. It reveals the opportunity for people to do it. So where does this take us? Where does this illustration take us? This illustration takes us to a whole discussion about cooperation and responsibility. If we want to look at globalization as a positive thing, if globalization is a positive phenomenon, globalization in all its forms, economic liberalization, revolution in digital technologies, exchange of culture, social forms, norms, ideas, if it is all positive, if it is to be a positive thing for human society, then it implies that the effects of, say, environmental degradation of particular national context would have considerable social and economic effects elsewhere. We have to recognize that. But are we also able to cooperate and take responsibility to do something about it, even if in the short term it does not affect our lives, but only drown, millions of people in some small island nation, or hurt the penguins in the Antarctic, or melt the ice caps in the Arctic? Why should we, looking at our everyday concerns, looking at the people who need their basic needs and whose basic needs have to be satisfied, to whom we have to provide education and health, and we have to create jobs, why should we be worried about the melting of the polar ice cap? In such situations, you do need nations to cooperate and take responsibility. Phenomena such as climate change, global warming, ozone depletion, due to irresponsible action of some nations, may harm poorer communities in other countries. Hence, transnational cooperation leading to appropriate regulation and allocation of responsibility for action are important social policy concerns today. These social policy concerns emerge directly from globalization, both the harm-causing parts of it as well as the solution-providing parts of it. One of the negative effects of globalization, one can look at it as a negative effect, or one can look at it as a transformation, is the transformation in the role of the welfare states. Several features of globalization actually erode the ability of the nation states to take a lot of autonomous decisions about social policies or social problems within their own national boundaries. This essentially happens primarily because of increase in the power and mobility of global capital. Global capital today can move really fast from one part of the world to the other. So if domestic or national government policies does not create good conducive condition for global capital to function, they are free to take their money elsewhere and create entrepreneurship or industries or jobs elsewhere in the world. This global competition in markets that has been released by globalization creates makes nation states very sensitive about the amount of money that they can spare for public provisioning for welfare or taking care of the vulnerable people in their society. It's highly informed by neoliberal policies, which are also antithetical to collectivist views, which means that collective good takes a back seat in comparison to individual goods. So if many individuals do well, it is argued, you can add up to be a collective good. But that is not necessarily need not often be the case, although it can be the case. It's better that a lot of individuals are doing well as against quite a lot of individuals are doing badly, but you have a strong sense of collective identity. Erosion of collective identities, however, can have implication if you remember the lecture on citizenship on obligation models of social policy in which individuals are supposed to sit down, allocate responsibility, and decide about what kind of social policy is good for the country. Greater role of supranational entities in designing your social policies. Good thing about that is one can look at social policies in a macro context and narrow down on big issues that affect almost everybody in the world. The negative effect of that could be that local needs and vulnerabilities and specificities get ignored, and which means that one might not create policies, although there may be a lot of groups and people in great need in national contexts. Globalization introduces newer risks in the society. If you remember our discussion of the emergence of the welfare state historically with the coming of capitalism and modernization and industrialization, risks created need for the emergence of welfare state. Globalization contributes to a disruption in the labor market owing to competition, lower wages, contractual nature of employment. Other disruptions range from loss of livelihoods to labor rights erosion to damaged cultural values and loss of political participation. Therefore, social policy assumes renewed significance to maintain the social stability, to expand welfare programs in order to provide safety net to those who are marginalized from the global market economy. If people lose jobs, if their livelihoods are disrupted, then their ability to take care of the contingencies that they experience in life are getting lesser and lesser. And if societies lose collectivist values, their ability or their willingness to help fellow citizens in need also goes down. Nation states, reducing the power of nation states, reduces their ability to allocate sufficient sums of money in their budget for social expenditure. All of this adds up to newer risks for vulnerable members of the society. Where does it take social policy? Are we therefore talking about an internationalization of social policy? Is it a good thing? Is it even desirable? To a great extent, social policy is already being internationalized, as we have seen from the setting of global targets to reduce vulnerabilities of global population. But is there a need for a common welfare program to cover common issues of globalization? Common social policies undertaken by supranational agencies can foster a sense of solidarity to support a common economic policy or a common welfare regime. Nation states may view social expenditure as a fiscal burden, reducing their competitive advantage in the global economy. In such situations, international contribution to finance social policy could be a real need in the years to come. Therefore, maintaining cooperation over social policy, just as taking responsibility for ameliorating harm that happens to people all over the world is a need for social policy in present times. To conclude, in this module, what have we learned? We have learned about the complex phenomena of globalization and its broad implication for social policy making at the national and global levels. You have also been introduced to key challenges and opportunity that globalization creates for policy making and the fluctuating role of the state in the kind of role that the state can play in designing these policies and being able to implement them effectively. You have also understood the newer risks that globalization brings to people and communities all over the world, because we live in a world that is connected in many new ways. And with that, we come to an end of the module in globalization. There are several references here for you to learn about globalization. You are especially advised to look at the Global Monitoring Report on the Millennium Development Goals and look at the various logic and arguments which are given for why some of the goals succeeded while others did not succeed. And that is an important lesson for internationalization of social policy in the context of globalization. Thank you.